Okay, glad to see everybody's here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about malicious use. Basically, we have a problem that as the AI systems get more intelligent and powerful, people can also use these systems for harm. So we have some capabilities like we want AI systems to be smarter to help with biology, but that could also help them be more capable at building a bioweapon. Or they could learn more about how to use a computer and program, but that could help them be better able at hacking. Or they could understand humans better, and that could make them be more empathetic in some ways, but that could also make them better at manipulation. So we have a problem that the risk from malicious use increases as the systems continue to scale and become more capable. And what we want to do is we want to reduce the risks of that malicious use. So I'm going to talk about how we measure the risks from some particular forms of malicious use and then propose a method to mitigate those risks. So the White House executive order focuses on some potential malicious use risks. They highlight 3 different categories. One is CBRNs, chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons. Another category is them being maliciously used as cyber weapons. And then the third is them being used for deception or obfuscation. And basically, this executive order from the White House is making the AI labs like XAI, OpenAI, and others evaluate their systems for their malicious use potential. Unfortunately, there isn't actually a measurement out there. So when I was visiting the White House, some person there suggested that maybe come up with some measurement because we have the policy written and they're going to have to start measuring it, but there isn't actually any benchmark. So, but I don't want to just do evaluation. I want to actually have the risks be reduced. If we're having a benchmark say there is a risk that they will use it for a bioweapon, that's not good enough. We already know that as they become more capable, once they're human level, of course, just by definition, they'll be able to build a bioweapon. So we instead need to not just focus on assessment, but also risk mitigation. But to do risk mitigation, we need to have the research community come up with methods to reduce those risks. That requires making the data and the evaluation public so that they can see the number go down, see the malicious use number go down. But that could be a problem in the case of bioweapons, because if you're evaluating what's its capability of creating a bioweapon, if you're putting bioweapon cookbooks out there and saying, can it fill in the gaps in these bioweapon cookbooks, that's extremely dangerous. And that also violates the US Bioterrorism Act. So we've got a bit of a problem in evaluating malicious use. So what we did was we created this data set called the Weapons of Mass Destruction Proxy data set, which has proxy measures for some of the things we care about, like its ability to build a bioweapon, or being used as a cyber weapon, or chemical weapons. Hopefully, in the next month or two, we'll get radiological and nuclear weapons. But the main idea is we're using proxies. We're not revealing the information hazards or the sensitive information. We're not saying, oh, here's how you could build a civilization-destroying pandemic, and maybe can the model fill in the gaps in this cookbook? We're not doing that. So instead what we're doing is we are probing its knowledge about related things. So does it know about some of the more dual-use research areas like reverse virology? Or in the case of cyber weapons, does it know how to use a particular hacking tool? Does it know like many of the API calls and things like that? So in this way, if we get rid of that hacking API knowledge or knowledge about reverse genetics, then it will be a lot less capable at achieving these types of malicious use. At the same time, we don't want to delete too much. I mean, if we're deleting the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, I don't think that's going a bit too far in reducing these sorts of capabilities. So what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to remove the yellow and, by extension, get rid of the red while preserving the green. So that's the basic idea for assessing the risks from these in a public way and reducing the risks by excising or carving out or removing or expunging or whatever you want to call it, the yellow blobs. To zoom into this process a bit, we are getting at precursors. So if we remove some information about enhanced potential of pandemic pathogens, that would be something we could remove, or we could remove neighboring concepts. If it knows about this specific fact, it likely knows about this other type of related fact as well. So that's the level of, that's how we can get some indirection, do this in a safer way. What we're doing, though, is we are using just multiple choice questions for querying knowledge. I'll speak at the end of how we can go further than just the multiple choice text questions. And the main challenge of this was finding experts. This is largely a management challenge because experts, maybe they're willing to write like 30 questions and they'll get exhausted. And there are only a few experts, or maybe a couple dozen experts in each specific area. So there's a substantial amount of just wrangling and convincing some people, hey, you know, can you allocate some of the time for this, and making this agreeable enough for them to work on it in these many different areas. That's why we don't have radiological and nuclear yet, because they're a lot harder to find, but I think recently we found some people who can help with that. The questions are written by subject area experts, and what we needed to do was we needed to try and make sure we're covering the larger risk chains in each of these areas. So for instance, for bioweapons, the risk chain is first ideation, and then one can design a bioweapon. You know, you culture the mammalian cells, et cetera, and it gets built. You test whether it actually does the thing. You learn, did it succeed or not? Maybe we need to iterate or redo something to make it happen. And then eventually it gets released. And this is, at a high level, what goes on in building a bioweapon, but I'm not revealing too much specifically. In the case of cyber, what you do first is collect background information on the target, then you identify vulnerabilities, then you exploit that by gaining unauthorized access, and then once you have gotten into the system, then you can carry out your various tasks. So that's the threat model at a high level for cybersecurity. Why would we care about the cybersecurity ones? You can imagine that the people using some advanced AI system could attack critical infrastructure, such as like power grids and whatnot, with these AI systems in the future. So if you're wanting to hear more about these threat models in detail, you can check out the safe.ai/blog, where we have a specific post on the bio threat and a specific post on the cyber threat, just to zoom into it. Because I'm not claiming that AIs them being able to hack is generally a bad thing. It's in some specific context is it potentially catastrophic. If they're finding a Chrome vulnerability, okay, then it gets patched the next day. Maybe that's not so bad. Maybe that just continued the cat and mouse game further. But other things like power grids and things like that aren't updated overnight. In fact, many of those haven't been updated in many years. So although we could, in theory, patch them, and that the AIs could come up with patches for them, if they're just not getting updated, then they're sitting ducks. So this is where AI can make the risks that we'd face fairly different. That random people could just attack critical infrastructure, whereas there'd be substantial barriers to entry. You're actually talking about like civilizational destabilization, because some rogue actors can actually pull that off with very little effort or costs imposed on them if AIs can facilitate that. So why does that matter for existential risk? If some people might ask, that could matter because that type of instability could fan the fuel for some sort of global turbulence or great power conflict. If countries' power grids are down and things like that, that might be a reasonable time for attacking. probability of X risk conditional on World War III, or some great power conflict greatly increases. So I'm just used to the older days when you need to defend why are you focusing on malicious use and things like that. So how are we going to reduce the capabilities, some of these hazardous capabilities? Well, here's a complicated figure for you. Here's a method we are proposing, which is an unlearning method where we have a forget term and a retain term. Let me just walk through the retain term. So we're going to make adjustments to the model, but we don't want the model forgetting everything it knew. We're trying to remove some of the information, but we don't want to get rid of the generic biology knowledge or the generic computer knowledge when we're deleting advanced virology or some specific cyber capabilities. So for this, we're just sampling from some distribution called the retain distribution. That can just be like Wikipedia text. And we're saying, model, make sure your representations are like what they were originally before we started this unlearning process. So that's all this term is doing. This other term is doing something a little more interesting. There's a forget distribution. The forget distribution depends. So we could take PubMed articles from, that are more dual use in nature. So reverse virology papers, for instance. And we could prompt the model. Let's go back. We could prompt the model to say, but before it sees that reverse virology paper, it's being prompted that you are a novice in reverse virology. And then that's put in front of the actual paper, and then the model gets a representation. That's called the novice representation. Then we feed in the PubMed paper, the reverse virology paper again. You are an expert in reverse virology. And then that gives us that representation. And then it's also fed in normally. What happens is we're subtracting this novice direction from this expert direction. And that's basically pointing in that more novice-like direction. So it's sort of activation pattern or its representations are more in a novice-like direction. And that nudges the model to read the paper and process that type of data as though it's more of a novice. So that's the forget loss, basically. Nudge it to think more like a novice. We'll have an update to the paper where we simplify this slightly in maybe a week or two, but the performance is about the same. It might just be slightly simpler than this, just as an aside. That's the method, forget and retain, and it looks like, here's information about the unlearning corpora. It looks like it works to some extent. We can see the virology information and the bioweapon information goes down to near random chance. The cyber weapon goes down to random chance. And MMLU, which is a data set we made some years ago, is largely preserved. A slight decrease in, there's a slight decrease in some of the bio and cyber types of areas. So it's almost production ready. This is one of the early papers on unlearning, so it's not completely solved. I've been wanting to get that to be a little bit smaller so that you can suggest this to industry, but hopefully with some additional work there won't be any trade-off in practice. And so it looks like it's possible to substantially disrupt the representation so that the models no longer have it in their capacity to answer those types of questions or demonstrate that type of knowledge. Here's its performance on some different subjects inside of MMLU. So you can see there's some slight degradation on college computer science or computer security, introductory, not advanced. There's a hit that should be probably closer to the blue line. And introductory virology goes down to around random chance levels. That shouldn't be happening. It's introductory virology. So there's still a way to go in improving the precision of the technique because it's deleting a bit too much introductory knowledge. Ideally, we'd just be excising the expert knowledge and not necessarily the introductory knowledge. Then if people are wanting a model with the expert knowledge inside of it, they could just get approval. If they're a virology PhD student, they could then, ask OpenAI specifically for those. So we're not saying nobody can have access to these capabilities, but you should make sure that it makes sense. In much the same way that if you want to do experiments on Ebola, you get clearance first. If you're wanting an AI that is capable of building a bioweapon, you need some approval beforehand. That's basically we're wanting to make that possible and give the companies the ability to require or to have their models have some specific capabilities be deleted. I should note that the pipeline for this is if a user is fine-tuning the model maliciously, before the model is handed back to the user, you run the unlearning technique. And then by the time they're querying the model, it has those capabilities removed. So that if people are trying to implant or remove the safeguards from these models in the future, then we can just run the unlearning technique so that when they're interacting with the model, it doesn't have those capabilities either added or when the safeguards are removed, the capability is not present. Here's a robustness check. What we're doing here is we're looking at two models. Zephyr 7b is basically like Llama 2, but then like a bit better. And then here's Yi 34b, which is one of the best open source models. And let's just look at what's happening with Zephyr 7b. Here's each layer. At each layer, we're training a probe. This could be a linear probe, a multi-layer perceptron, what have you, and it's trying to answer the questions in the data set. So this is like, is the model trying to hide that it knows the answer? And it doesn't look like it. If you train a probe at each layer and an AI is trying to, given the information and representations at the layer, trying to extract the answer, it can't recover any useful information for predicting the correct answer. So that's evidence that the knowledge isn't just hiding in there if you deliberately have AIs try to uncover it. And what happens is after we apply the cut method, bio is higher, the accuracy increases. But if we use the cut method, the solid green line, then it's basically around random chance levels. So after the method is applied, can't recover the information from those representations. And then as a further robustness check, we used GCG. GCG is an adversarial attack that the Center for AI Safety and Carnegie Mellon proposed last summer, which are automated adversarial attacks. By default, if you ask an AI, hey, could you make me a bioweapon or something like that, the AI will refuse. If it unlearns, it'll refuse in some way. But if you do an adversarial prompt, if you have some /23 jumping jacks and just gibberish, specifically crafted gibberish, then that will break the model. The suffix is found through that adversarial attack. And that will break the model, but if you have the unlearned model, it's not in its capacity to do it either. So we weren't able to come with any adversarial attacks that recovered or nudged or caused the model to play along and say how to build a bioweapon. So that's, those are two robustness checks. Maybe it's still in there, and so I think there's still more investigation that could be done to have more confidence. But at the very least, we've made it harder for the adversaries to recover these sorts of capabilities, and I think that's the primary objective. One last thing is, does this actually relate to, is the WMDP using these proxies, does this actually correlate to info hazards or hazardous knowledge? So we had some questions that we're not willing to release because they're too sensitive and they could get us in trouble. But if we apply the cut method, it also generalizes to that different set of hazardous sorts of questions. So it does seem to make them basically become unknowledgeable about the things that we actually care about. So, and then in the future, we've got a few things. One is, it seems tractable given ongoing conversations that maybe this could be a standard in the upcoming National Defense Authorization Act, which happens each year, and that potentially that could be added as a standard for model developers to assess and track that. That'd be relevant, like if a new administration comes in and gets rid of the current executive order, then this would still be a DoD recommendation. We're looking into the radiological and nuclear question sets. Another paper, which maybe is a month or two away, provided that it is as robust as we're hoping it is what happens if one of these models is released. We apply the unlearning method, but then it gets open sourced or leaked. Then how easy is it to add those capabilities back? And what it's currently looking like is that we can make it be the case that the adversaries can't add all those capabilities back. So how can we sort of robustly put on those guardrails or robustly get it to unlearn even if they try and fine-tune it back in? Can we make that much harder for the adversaries, or will we make it more will we make it so that they can't recover that level of knowledge had we not done that unlearning? And then finally, probably going to do, it's in early stages, probably going to do a multimodal bioweapons one, because we were just doing text-based questions. But another set of questions would be more about lab processes. So given an AI in a lab, like imagine we have an AI assistant, and you like take a picture, like here's my lab, here's my counter, here's the Petri dish, and things like that. What should I do next? And then it says, put that in this. And you go, okay, great. What should I do next? And so something that can guide you through the actual weaponization rather than largely testing more academic, codified knowledge about virology, but something a bit more hands-on and ecologically valid would be important too. I mean, I think testing for the knowledge of advanced virology makes the potential bioweapon substantially more dangerous, potentially orders of magnitude more dangerous, but a big bottleneck as well is just having non-expert people do a lot of the basic lab procedures. That's also an important component to test for. So anyway, those are some of the things we're doing about malicious use. I mean, I guess there's others as well, like there's liability legislation that's currently that we've co-sponsored. That's currently in the California State Senate, and that might get passed, which would make them liable if their AI causes a catastrophe and whatnot, and would make them create incentives, strong incentives for them to add safeguards against malicious use. But for all that, I think that's probably all I need to say about that. So I guess if we move on to questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yes, from Kenneth, in the back row. Please keep your hand up while the mic is coming towards you.
Thank you for the talk, Dan. So if I understand correctly, you worked with 3 different data sets. So there's the D-retained data set, which I think you said you sampled from PubMed. And then there's the WMDP data set, which is for evaluation. And then you also have a third private test set, also for evaluation. Could you clarify the relationships between these 3 different data sets?
Yeah, so there's a retained data set, which could be wiki text, it could be other types of data sets, just some generic text that would help it not forget its original representations. Then there's different types of forget sets. You could do these more dual-use papers on PubMed. For cyber, you could get some API documentation or documentation from GitHub. There's the actual evaluation data set, which would be WMDP, and then there's also a private evaluation data set which did not pass, like ITAR review and screening for sensitive information and things like that, and that's one that we just use to check whether reduction in WMDP results in a reduction on this other data set of more hazardous information.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So my understanding is, people have been trying to do unlearning for a little while, and a lot of previous attempts have failed to either excise the knowledge or have had really bad effects on out-of-task performance. Do you have a intuition for what the key thing about your method that makes it work is?
I mean, one thing is that I think focusing on output level stuff is, there are some different ways people have tried pursuing unlearning. One would be focus on output level, like at the final layer do something, and that's the usual way you try and control AI systems. Another way is mechanistic interpretability at a neuron level, and I think we're trying to focus on the representation level, and try and control it there. I think that's the that's a unit of analysis that I think is productive and more neglected. I think more people have been poking around in the mechanistic, and I think we have a lot of methods lying around for controlling at the output level. So I just don't think there are that many people poking around of trying to steer or control the models at the representation level, at the weights or the activations.
I have two questions. Both of them are kind of interlinked. The first one is regarding to this slide that you've opened up right now. The code representation that you've elaborated here, it's mainly, right now, it's working on closed source models, if I'm correct in my assumption. So far, you said working on APIs, meaning it's not ready for open source models, to alter the representation of them or change them fundamentally, so that even if you were to fine-tune, retrain, do whatever you want with it, it would still unlearn all those malicious, threats in different domains. And that's the first question. The second one is, well, if you were to do that, let's say, my only, I don't know if it's, how should I say it? It's a concern, or I guess I don't know if this is going to be the final way to unlearn stuff, but this might or might not have an adverse effect on interdisciplinary disciplines that the original threat domain is linked to it. For example, if it's biomedical and if you want to kind of remove a subset of very specific domain knowledge of, let's say, how to build stuff, but at the same time, if you're not connecting those dots with other interlinked subdomains, then you're kind of ignoring them and just focusing on a very subset of the malicious threat, which basically means you're leaving out gaps which can be learned later indirectly. Does that make sense? It's kind of hard to explain, but it's the neighbor point of view which I explained over here, I guess. So 2 questions. Sorry if it's complicated.
Yeah. So I think that the unlearning first is just in the closed source or the behind the API setting, trying to provide something that's usable to make those models be safer and less likely to be maliciously used. And we have some other paper that's ongoing where hopefully we can also have it withstand people trying to fine-tune the information back into the model. But that seems like a substantially harder problem. Hopefully, hopefully as we do more, at least another month of robustness testing or so, we'll be able to stand behind that. I guess on the other thing, I'm largely envisioning something like a know your customer regime, such that if they want access to these types of capabilities, they would just have sufficient warrant or reason for asking for it. So I think that's reasonable. And possibly the people from related disciplines could also ask for this, but they certainly need some reason, and it's not the case that a random disgruntled teenager can, launch some cyber attack on the power grid or something. I just don't think that's a reasonable world to be in. So yeah, I think that there are ways of getting at that, though, but that largely depends on the specifics of how we'll implement know your customer regimes and things like that, which would be important to improve and tinker in policy starting soon.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more. Let's go for...
Yes, thank you so much for the talk. I'm curious how you see this sort of evaluation regime compared to things that are also being tried close to the labs currently, so task-based, where you try to demonstrate one risk, see is a model capable of actually doing a thing that is within this risk schema, and trying to test the whole task through, compared to this more like, I guess, row-based, dataset-based benchmark. And then separately from that, what to the audience here would you be interested in seeing more of in this direction, now that you are also talking with policymakers, now that you are talking with the people who are actually going to secure the models in the end, or at least provide.
Maybe I'll take the second question first. I think generally measuring safety properties would be quite useful. I mean, we've measured CBRN plus cyber, and there's a bit more to. I think there's a bit more to do in testing more procedural knowledge with bio, but generally we have maybe it was announced a week or two or so ago, a safe bench where if you have benchmark ideas and if they're good, then there's prizes for those. So I think there's like $250,000 worth of prizes, and hopefully you can come up with metrics that would inform policy. So that if this number is really high, that's a bad sign, and then that also enables the research community to try and get that number be lower, or implement safeguards to make that number lower. So that would be generally, I think, trying to quantify these things would be important, and quantify them in a way that makes it suitable for, and getting at your first question, suitable for risk mitigation. I think if it's, now it's suddenly able to do this, whereas it previously wasn't, I don't think those sorts of evaluations are as useful for risk mitigation, because you need to continually chip away at the risks, not just have indicator functions of whether some type of risk is present. So for people to hill climb and evolve methods, they need more signal than just one-bit communication. So that's just a design principle I push for strongly, and I think other ones are looking at trying to come up with some threshold type of capabilities or just indicators. I think it should be more continuous. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Dan?
Okay, great.
It's a pleasure to have you.